Hello, and welcome to the latest installment of the Minds Energy Future podcast. We are joined by Suzanne Greene, who is the program manager at MIT Sustainable Supply Chains. Thank you for joining us, Suzanne.
Thanks, Jordy. It's fun to be here on the podcast and to join you in Colorado School of Mines.
You're part of the Coalition on Materials Emission Transparency, and we're seeing kind of a growing pressure on companies to deal with carbon accounting and carbon disclosure. Why do you feel like we need to address this issue?
Yeah, so carbon accounting, that's something I've been working on for quite some time at MIT and how companies do it and what is useful and how can we use this information in a way that we can to make sustainability part of the decision-making process that businesses go through. And so carbon accounting is part of that because it quantifies something that's very hard to quantify. So how do you count visible gas, right? So that's really the thing that we're trying to figure out is we have a pollutant that comes out from fossil fuel combustion and other things. How do we put a number on it? And, when it comes to your operations, if you're running a mine or running a factory, you generally know what you're emitting because you know how much fuel that you purchased and you know what type of fuel you burned in your operations. So that's not too hard. You convert the fuel to CO2. So that's a conversion. It's okay. What we miss in the conversation is the carbon footprint of your supply chain, the products and the services that you buy to make your own products or your own services, and then what happens to your product after it leaves your hands. So that upstream and downstream supply chain, that's the part that it's really hard to understand the carbon emissions on. And that's what we've been trying to puzzle through and through my work at MIT and with the Comet.
Can you explain a little bit why it's so hard to keep track of those supply chain emissions or why it's so hard for companies to go about reporting them?
Sure. So, a lot of companies, when they're sourcing things for their supply chain, they know who they bought it from. So say I buy a laptop. I bought it from Apple. Maybe I know that it was made in China. Right? Maybe I even know it was made at a particular factory in China. Maybe I know it was made at Foxconn factory in China. But from there, it gets more complicated because that's an inherent kind of assembly. It's a place where your laptop is assembled, right? So there's many other suppliers that bring the screws and the aluminum and the optical drives and, all the different things that go into a laptop. That comes generally from other suppliers. So most companies typically have that first layer of visibility, directly who they bought it from. But then there's all the other suppliers up from there that is quite hard to know, and it might change over time. So they might source their screws from one place, at one time and another place at a different time. So you're not really sure from where they came. And when we think about something like metals and minerals, which we are often doing, it gets even more complicated because it goes down to the mine level. So very few companies have visibility on what mine did this mineral come from. And so that hasn't been necessarily on the radar of a lot of companies until the Dodd-Frank Act came along. So that was about conflict minerals, right? So like cobalt, for example, tungsten, tantalum, that type of thing that may have come from, say, the Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo in Africa, which is known for slave labor. So when that came up, then people became very concerned, actually, where did that mineral come from? And so that's a sustainability issue related to ethical problems. But when we think about CO2, it's really the same thing. We need to understand all the way back to the mine from which these things came to really know what the true carbon footprint is. And that is quite a challenging task.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially when you're talking about these kind of inputs that you see for different technical elements, especially, laptops, like you were saying, right? Like there's the screws come from someplace, the screen comes from someplace, and all these other materials come from different places. So for carbon accounting for minerals and metals, like you were saying, it's really important to kind of have this transparency all the way back to the mine. How do you envision the future being where like full accountability of of these minerals and metals is taking place? What does it look like when companies are able to properly report their emissions and we have kind of this visibility at the mine level?
Well, we could imagine a couple different scenarios. So one scenario could be full visibility, where every atom is tracked on the blockchain, right? We know where every atom came from and how it got processed and how it got shipped and every step it went through before it came to me. So that would be maybe your materials, like imagine like a briefcase that gets filled with different information as this molecule or atom passes along the supply chain. So that would be like, okay, it would be a dream scenario. You know everything that happened. But that is quite unrealistic, maybe you could say, or maybe someday someone will crack this code because, for now it's too much information, right? It would be a lot of data that would need to be stored. And another complication is often these minerals are melted down in a blast furnace, right? They're not, an RFID tag is not going to withstand the blast furnace. So, things get mixed together and, multiple mines might get mixed in with one shipment. It's a commodity product. So, once it's mixed together, it's hard to know where it came from. So then we get into a vaguer situation, which is kind of where we're at, is where you generally know where something came from. So maybe you can begin to narrow it down, which steel processing plant was my iron ore made? Where you can kind of look to like which parts of the supply chain do we know make a big difference in terms of the carbon emissions. So if you want to reduce carbon emissions from the steel that you bought, the first thing we think about, right, is the carbon emissions from the steel making process, because that's where the big emissions lie in an iron ore supply chain. And right now, there's maybe not so many options. The differentiation between the different steel makers maybe is not so great. So, okay, what do we need to know in that case where there's not that much difference from different suppliers? Then maybe we can just make a guess. Well, we know the average steel maker in China has this much CO2 per ton of steel produced. So that's kind of where we're at right now, is where we can generally know basically what the emissions are. But where it's going to get interesting, I think, and hope, is that we'll see different parts of the supply chain begin to decarbonize. So when and if there is a zero carbon steel, if it's made with hydrogen and, there's a new type of steel out there that is low or zero carbon, then you might say, that's the steel I want to buy for my new building in Golden, Colorado. And that's where it gets more interesting, right? Where you want to source something that came out of that low or zero carbon steel environment, and you want that number reflected in your carbon footprint. So MIT has a climate goal. We want to buy that zero carbon steel too for our buildings. We want to get our carbon footprint down to zero. So that's our goal too. And I think that's the kind of dynamic we're beginning to see, where we want to know when we're buying something quote unquote good.
Yeah, and that makes sense as well, especially when you're talking about these future climate goals. We have these goals we're trying to meet, and we're just now finding out that we don't really know how our emissions are coming from or being sourced. That's a great point. You mentioned a little bit about kind of a differentiation between different sources of materials. Do you see that happening in the future, or do you feel like that's a necessary step for kind of these carbon mitigation goals?
I definitely see that happening. And I think that's where the attention has gone towards the mines now, where we're looking at the mines, not just for their labor practices, but we're looking at how are they really decarbonizing. And we see mining companies wanting to reduce their emissions, right? They're on board with these plans. They're just far down the supply chain and often out of our view. But if you pay attention, they are looking to invest or already investing in, electric trucks, different, electrifying their operations, getting off of diesel power, getting off of coal. What can they do? So I think that's where it gets, we want to look back to the mine and see where are these investments happening and how can you connect your supply chain to them. And, many mining companies have maybe hundreds of mines. So they might have 10% of their mines have gone electric and 90% aren't. So then we think, okay, is there a way to source only from the companies or the mining company's mine that is decarbonized and not from the other ones? So I think we're going to see, maybe some like industry relationships there where a company, maybe an automaker, says, I'm only going to source from this mine that I know is green because I want to be a zero carbon supply chain, for my car company. So I think we've seen a little bit of that with Tesla, that they've been looking at, a single mine for their lithium, and maybe even, thinking about buying a mine. How can they be sure that they get their lithium from the right place? So that kind of relationship will be interesting to track and to see how you can actually do that, knowing the complexities of, what happens after a metal or mineral leaves the mine and goes into processing.
Yeah, I think you're right about this growing interest in these tracking these supply chains. You mentioned the Dodd-Frank Act earlier, and we saw that with platinum group metals. And I know Tesla and Philips have already announced that they're trying to get reduce the cobalt in their batteries, like you were saying, just for historical ethical problems in the Congo. So you represent MIT in the Coalition of Materials Emissions Transparency, otherwise known as COMET. Can you explain a little bit how COMET might fit into these carbon mitigation goals, these supply chain tracking or market differentiation?
Yeah, absolutely. So we founded the COMET, actually, with you, Jordy, and the Payne Institute, Colorado School of Mines, and the Rocky Mountain Institute, and the Columbia Center for Sustainable Investment. We founded the COMET about a year ago with this in mind, that, hey, it's hard to know what minerals you're buying. It's really hard to know. It's hard to make these connections in the supply chain. It's really hard to know, to compare one mineral to another, or one source of a mineral to another source of a mineral. There isn't that visibility in the supply chain. And we see the market for this information because we see so many climate goals coming out. We see so many companies setting, huge targets for their products, that we realize that they don't have the tools to quantify and to track these carbon emissions to know if they're reaching their goals. So without information from your supply chain and without that kind of more detailed information, how are you going to know if you succeeded, right? You're going to be relying on industry average numbers. So this is what happens a lot these days. And that's what we're looking at with the COMET is, if you use average numbers, the average CO2 for a ton of steel, you're not going to see these differences like we were talking about from different processors and mines. So that's kind of what inspired our founding of the COMET, is just, noticing this kind of this interesting time where the world is going low carbon, and low carbon means low carbon energy. And, we all met via the World Bank's Climate Smart Mining program, right? So that's how this kind of came to be, is we're learning about this, the extreme mineral intensity of these low carbon energy solutions, that we need steel, copper, concrete, aluminum, rare earth elements, zinc, molybdenum. We need all this crazy stuff to make a wind turbine. And where is it coming from? So that's really the big question. And, so when I hear a company say, we're going zero carbon because we're going to renewable energy, I instantly think, yeah, but what about the footprint of the energy, the technology that's making that energy? So that's kind of where all this came about, is that interplay between mining that is generally off our radar and then this huge global push to low carbon energy that we see happening. And add and sprinkle into that, that we know mining companies want to go on this journey too. They are also adopting low carbon energy technologies in their own operations. And, they're all combined together. And so we founded the COMET to just bring attention to this issue and to say, this actually is a problem we can solve. It's not a problem that is unsolvable because the players along the supply chain know. So it's more of a communication issue in the end, a data issue, data sharing issue than it is an actual problem. So we think we can change that.
Yeah, and you mentioned that mining companies are very interested in doing this, and I especially like how you tied everything kind of back to the materials, the energy transition. That's something that we focus a lot on the Pain Institute, and we completely agree with you that the future is going to be much more material intensive, and if we don't start looking at kind of these emissions and how they play into our carbon goals, just from extracting the materials to build, like you're saying, wind turbines and solar panels and electric vehicles, that we risk kind of further damaging the earth at the same while we're trying to save it at the same time. And that's not really a good goal. So do you feel like there's anything stopping the mining companies? Like how come this hasn't progressed in the way that we want it to? It seems like mining companies are making these goals, and they are kind of making these large announcements that they're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to reduce their emissions. But I guess part of the reason to me seems like it's because they sell an anonymous good. So they sell a good that, like you're saying, like there's all the steel goes into one, kind of blast furnace, and there's no way to tell what mine goes into that. So do you see mining companies kind of responding to this initiative through comment, this idea that if we get more information, it could lead to these changes?
Definitely. So I think they're super interested because they know that they need to communicate this information to their buyers. They want to communicate this information. They want to show that they're making good on their promises and they're truly decarbonizing. And they don't really have a way to do that. It's hard for them to tell us all the good things they're doing. And, that's kind of the interesting thing about carbon accounting is that's how it comes through. Like all your hard work in the end, sure, boils down to a ton of CO2 per ton of your product. That's the number we're looking for. Like, what is the carbon footprint of the thing you're making? And they can tell us that. But what my impression of what is lacking is the demand for that information. So the upstream buyers, they don't always know that they can ask. So we are trying to inspire that movement to ask me for my carbon footprint. How can you tell me what my carbon footprint is? And we need that demand for the numbers because, like I said, the companies, the actual operators, they know, but you need to ask them to tell you the answer. Okay. And so that's the part we're working on, is trying to get the demand for the information going along the supply chain, but also make it easy to calculate. It shouldn't be rocket science to calculate your carbon footprint. And it kind of feels like that, for a lot of companies and people, like, oh, it feels so technical. This lady from MIT is trying to tell me how to do it. She's nerdy, like, oh, this feels hard. So we're trying to bust that stereotype because it shouldn't be that hard. It should be, in fact, relatively easy to do. And it should be information that's worthwhile. So, a lot of companies report their carbon emissions to CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Company, and Carbon Disclosure Project. And it takes them a lot of effort to get the numbers together. And it's hard for them to do that. And they spend a lot of hours. And in the end, maybe they see, well, no one's looking, no one's checking. It's just an exercise you go through. No one actually is really using the numbers besides to say, did you do it or did you not do it? Did you report or not report? So we want to take it to the next level, that it's not about yes or no. It's not a binary thing. Did you report or not? But what numbers should you be reporting that are actually useful to the other people, the other companies along the supply chain? We don't want to make work for work's sake. At least I'm very practical. I think this needs to be something that is useful. And, some of the things that companies calculate in terms of their carbon emissions are not necessarily the most useful things in terms of supply chain decarbonization. So we see a lot of companies, Jordy, this, focusing on their employees' business travel. Okay, that is something you should think about, and it is important, but it's a relatively small emitter compared to your actual operation. So I want companies to focus time and energy where the emissions are and be practical about it.
Yeah, and That makes sense, when you explain it that way, especially with the way that companies are making all these grand announcements that they're going to reduce their emissions. And then we actually look into what they're reporting, and like you're saying, it's mostly just their client or their employees' travel or things that aren't really making these larger impacts. And it seems almost like we're advocating for like the emissions facts on the back of a soup can to tell you what type of materials went into it and what type of emissions get into it. And I love your point that, you said you wish that more people just ask for this because the information can be available. So for a final thought, are there anything that you think that maybe the average person should know or that they can do to help this movement, or maybe if there's some CEOs or some corporate investors that are interested in this, what can they learn, or what should they be thinking about that makes this especially relevant?
I mean, something I like to say to inspire people is really, the same theme. Ask questions and make it an expectation to get the answer, right? And consider CO2 as a KPI in your own business. Okay, so you can do that. You can embed CO2 as a decision-making factor. It doesn't have to be the only thing you'll make the decision around, but you can use it as a tool in your decision-making. You can look at your supplier and say, look at their carbon footprint and say, is this the material I want to buy? One might have a higher footprint, one lower. One might be cheaper, one might be more expensive. So in the end, the cheaper product might win, but at least you know that it did have a higher carbon footprint. Okay, knowledge is power. At least you know. And the average person, really most people have no clue what it is that they're buying. Have any even like a magnitude of understanding about what the carbon footprint of something is. So one of the first studies I ever did at MIT was related to the banana. What is a carbon footprint of a banana? What's the carbon footprint of a shoe? These are not things people know. So, I wish people were marching in the streets for a carbon footprint number. So if I could call Greta, I would call her and say, why don't you ask so you have some numbers? Because I think it's frustrating for young people, especially, that this thing is happening, climate change is happening, and we don't feel like we have any tools to deal with it. Like, I can't do anything different in my life, or I'm just guessing what I could do differently in my life to lower my carbon footprint. Like, I know I shouldn't fly. Okay, so like everyone thinks don't fly. But is that really the thing that is the highest impact in your life? I think the numbers are missing. So if we had some better numbers on our everyday products, at least we could put that into our decision making at the grocery store, on Amazon, whatever it is we're buying, or, when we go buy steel, whatever it is, putting some numbers on it so we at least get in the mindset of having a rough clue that, hey, the banana that I'm eating has about 120 grams of CO2 embodied in it. Now I know.
Yeah, and you can start making these decisions based on actual data, like you were saying. I've never in my life thought what the carbon footprint of a banana is, and
it's like going on a diet, right? We all need to go on a CO2 diet, right? Maybe we're all doing that right now because we're forced to because of coronavirus. We're all stuck inside. We're not flying around. But, we know we need to go on a carbon diet, but you can't do it if you have no clue if you're eating a donut or an apple. Like, we don't know if we have a donut or an apple here. So we need the numbers. That's how we're going to make the change, in my opinion.
That's a great way to put it. I mean, I've had a lot of conversations about carbon accounting, but I think that's probably the simplest, most succinct way I've ever heard it. And thank you for your time, Suzanne. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and giving us this lecture on carbon accounting, carbon diets, as we should refer to it from now on.
Thanks, Jordy. It's my pleasure.